$499 US and 549 Canadian dollars. And the 60 gigabyte PlayStation 3 for $599 US, $659 Canadian.
Kutaragi was at a central Tokyo electronics store to hand over the first console, which went to a man from China who didn't give his name. Kutaragi said he was pleased at the turnout, which numbered around 1,000 people at the store.
What's up, guys? I make my biannual return this time to tell you about the PS3. You may say, well, haven't I already done a video about it? And you'd be right, but that is not a good video, and this one is. So, anyway. The PS3 is arguably the most ambitious console ever made. It might also be the most troubled launch in gaming history, depending on your tolerance for $599 price tags and a processor that made developers want to quit the industry. It was ahead of its time, behind the times, and somehow still has a running digital storefront in 2026, which is more than you can say for the Xbox 360. First, let's talk about what was actually inside this thing. Because by 2006 standards, the PS3 was genuinely impressive hardware. By today's standards, it's an absolute miracle that The Last of Us ever ran on it. The GPU, which Sony and Nvidia called the RSX, or Reality Synthesizer, was built on a 90nm process and packed 24 pixel shaders, 8 vertex shaders, 24 TMUs, 8 ROPs, and was paired with 256 megabytes of dedicated GDDR3 memory. For context, a GPU with that much VRAM has not been made in at least the last 16 years. Then there's the Cell processor. The real story of the PS3, and honestly one of the most ambitious chip designs in consumer history. Developed jointly by Sony, Toshiba and IBM, the Cell ran at 3.2 GHz on a PowerPC based architecture. But the interesting part is how it was structured. Instead of one powerful general-purpose CPU core, it had one main PowerPC core paired with 7 co-processors called Synergistic Processing Elements, or SPEs. In practice, developers only had access to 6 of those SPEs. One was kept in reserve for the OS, and another was disabled across all retail units to improve manufacturing yields. The idea was that if developers could learn to use all those SPEs in parallel, they'd get performance that was genuinely ahead of anything else available. The problem was that actually doing that was incredibly difficult, and most developers, especially in the early years, just didn't. Both the Cell and RSX each had their own 256 megabytes of RAM, giving the system 512 total, but they couldn't freely share it, which caused its own headaches. Here's where it gets interesting. Sony's original plan for the PS3 apparently didn't even include a dedicated GPU. The thinking was that the Cell processor was powerful enough to handle everything on its own. It was Naughty Dog who reportedly demonstrated to Sony that the Cell alone wasn't going to cut it for the kind of games they wanted to make. So fairly late in development, Sony went to Nvidia and commissioned what became the RSX. The console launched in November 2006 in Japan and North America, and November 2007 in Europe, at the frankly eye-watering price of $599 USD for the top model. That price was largely driven by the inclusion of a Blu-ray drive, which Sony was banking on to win the format war against HD DVD. That bet did pay off, with Blu-ray winning in the end, but it made the PS3 brutally expensive at launch. The early hardware also had a significant reliability problem. Those first generation units used a 90nm RSX, and a flaw in the manufacturing process meant that a large portion of consoles produced between 2006 and 2008 were prone to what became known as the yellow light of death, essentially a complete hardware failure, usually caused by the solder joints on the RSX cracking under thermal stress. Sony moved to a 65nm RSX in 2008, which largely fixed the issue, but a lot of early adopters had a rough time. One other thing that the early 90nm models had that the later ones didn't: hardware-based PS2 backwards compatibility, and a feature called Other OS, which lets you install a Linux distribution on top of the console. Both of these were removed in later hardware revisions and software updates to cut costs. The removal of other OS in particular, via firmware update 3.21 in April 2010, ended up being a pretty significant moment in the PS3 story, but we'll get to that. As developers slowly figured out how to actually use the cell architecture, the games got genuinely impressive. The best looking PS3 titles, The Last of Us, God of War Ascension, Gran Turismo 6, all came out right as the PS4 was launching, which says a lot about how much headroom the hardware actually had once people knew what they were doing. Right, so firmware update 3.21, Sony removed the Other OS feature, officially citing security concerns. The actual security concern, it turned out, was a hacker named GeoHot.
Yo, it's GeoHot! And for those that don't know,
who had used Other OS to start poking around at the PS3's hypervisor. Sony's response was to remove the feature entirely. This did not go over well. Around the same time, a hacking group called Fail Overflow was doing their own research. They discovered a critical security flaw in how Sony was generating their eCDSA cryptographic signatures used to verify software on the PS3. They were reusing the same random number in their signing algorithm, which under eCDSA means you can mathematically recover the private key if you have enough signed data, which Fail Overflow did. They announced this at the Chaos Communication Congress meet in December 2010, a yearly security conference held in Hamburg, and demonstrated that they could run arbitrary unsigned code without any hardware modifications. They chose not to release the private key publicly though, since their goal was just to restore the Other OS feature. Then GeoHot went ahead and published the private key anyway. Once the private key is out, anyone can sign any code and run it on any PS3. Sony filed a lawsuit against GeoHot and Fail Overflow shortly after, citing DMCA and CFAA violations. The case against GeoHot settled a few months later, with him agreeing not to reverse engineer Sony products further. But by that point it didn't really matter. The key was already public. Using that key, GeoHot and others produced a modified version of firmware 3.55 that included a custom app loader, making it straightforward to run homebrew software. This became known as custom firmware, or CFW. Sony tried patching the exploit in subsequent updates, getting to firmware 3.60 before the community couldn't immediately bypass it. Their response was to require users to be on the latest firmware to access PlayStation Network, which meant you had to choose between custom firmware and online access. Custom firmware only works on the original Fat PS3 and certain early Slim models. The later Super Slim and most Slim units produced after a certain point have hardware-level mitigations that block full CFW. For those consoles, there's an alternative called PS3 Hen, or Homebrew Enabler, which has to be activated on every boot, but is otherwise pretty stable. On the CFW side, things kept developing. A notable release was Rebug CFW in 2011, which gave retail PS3s access to many of the options normally only available on developer hardware. In 2017, a tool was released to convert firmware 4.82 to custom firmware, and in 2020, a tool called Begurville's toolset extended that to cover firmware 4.75, and all the way through to current versions. Sony has tried repeatedly to patch it out and hasn't succeeded, so it remains the main entry point for jailbreaking CFW-capable consoles. One thing worth mentioning that a lot of people don't realize, the PS3's digital storefront is actually still running as of the time I'm making this video, which puts it in a surprisingly rare category. Sony tried to shut it down back in 2021, announced it publicly and then reversed course after significant community pushback. The Xbox 360's marketplace was shut down in July 2024, making the PS3 arguably the only 7th generation console with a still functional digital store. How much longer it'll stay up is anyone's guess. Sony hasn't said anything publicly, but it's a nice reminder that the console's ecosystem hasn't fully gone dark yet. Before the conclusion, a quick word. This video was brought to you by my Patreon, which is just me asking you for money. If you've enjoyed the video and want to help me keep making them, you can support the channel over at patreon.com/Mazandrak or click the link in the description. Patrons get early access to videos and my eternal gratitude, which is worth almost nothing, but is very genuine. Even just $1 a month genuinely makes a difference, so if you're feeling generous, the link is in the description. Anyway, back to the PS3. The PS3 is one of those consoles that's genuinely fascinating to look back on. It was wildly ambitious, borderline impossible to develop for, launched at a price that made jaws drop, and then somehow became home to some of the best games of its generation. Games such as Uncharted 2, The Last of Us, Metal Gear Solid 4, Demon's Souls, all hold up incredibly well. And even today, there's still a pretty active community around it, between the jailbreaking scene and people just playing through the back catalog. Not bad for hardware that launched almost 20 years ago. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Drop a like if you enjoyed, maybe consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next time. Have a great day.